Hi, this is Suzanne. It's so nice to be here as part of Normal Fest of the Brain. Welcome to everyone who's joining us. I'm going to jump straight in, actually. We're going to be talking about people, power, and pandemics. And I've got three fantastic guests who I'm going to bring through, Dr. Jerome Lubbe, Dr. Joy Jones, and Dr. Timothy Rittman. So welcome. So rather than me taking up time introducing you, I'm going to go around and ask you guys to tell us a little bit about yourself and why you're here. And then after that, I'll give a bit of context and we'll jump straight in. So Tim, you first.
Hi, Suzanne. Yeah, thanks for the invite to join this panel. It's really exciting. So my name's Tim. I'm Tim Rittman. I'm a neurologist at Addenbrooke's Hospital in Cambridge, and I work with people with dementia, and I'm a neuroscientist as well, studying people with dementia and other diseases using brain imaging type methods. And I'm really interested in this topic because this idea of power and how it affects the brain is really intrinsic to who we are and how we see the world. So I'm really excited to have a chat about this in the next hour.
Joy, welcome.
Hi, welcome everybody. Happy World Mental Health Day. It's the beginning of the day here for me. It's at the end of the day there for you guys. My name is Dr. Joy Jones. I'm a physician. I'm board certified in family medicine and now completing board certification in psychiatry. I'm someone who's always been very interested in the arts and sciences. As a child, I was making pop songs and then dismantling clocks and grasshoppers on the other end, which makes me sound a little problematic, but I turned out okay. Eventually, after university, wasn't sure I wanted to go into medicine, went to London under the guise of graduate school, completed a master's in medical anthropology while I was still writing music and doing poetry. So I've always been balancing those two sides of my life. Right now, I am really working in the field, I call it liberation medicine. I'm really focused on helping disenfranchised communities, working in the fields of health empowerment to help individuals, communities, and really the whole globe do the things that they want to do in life, which has everything to do with power. So I'm really happy to be here and part of this conversation with you guys.
Thank you so much and welcome, Jerome. Certainly not least, but last in this section.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the chance to be on the call with you guys. I'm a little bit of a blend of both Tim and Joy's story. I'm actually originally an undergrad in digital animation and special effects production. I used to do music full-time with my identical twin brother and my older brother. I'm probably the only doctor that I know that has 5/8" gauges and a beard like this. But you know, my arc and my history of how I got here is I'm actually, from a very quick bullet point, I'm actually a refugee kid from Congo. I was born in South Africa and my family immigrated to the States on asylum status in the early 90s. So I don't look the role. But my family actually immigrated to the States in the early 90s to Tennessee, and the transfer from Zaire to Northeast Tennessee, very interesting. But what brought me into the space that I'm in is I started experiencing pretty profound migraines at 17, went to 21 specialists over 9 years, and realistically only became a doctor because I couldn't find one that knew how to work on the particular issues that I was having. I have pretty aggressive Chiari malformation and some brainstem damage. So I became a clinician trying to find answers similar to the patients that I was working with. So I love the topic that we're talking about, not only as somebody who can relate to what it looks like to be an immigrant kid, but also what it looks like to relate to being a patient as well as a clinician. And I ended up getting a doctorate in chiropractic, but secondary postgraduate board certifications in functional neurology. And I'm also board eligible in traumatic brain injury and nonverbal autism. So it's a lot of different spaces that I've been able to intersect. And I'm just grateful to be in the conversation with everybody.
Wow. So I don't think, Jerome, that you can quite be as grateful and as joyous as I am. So what I thought I'd do is kind of give everyone a quick kind of introduction to what I'm doing and what I'm thinking and why I wanted to sit around a metaphorical table with you three. As I said, my name's Suzanne. I call myself a cultural thinker. which essentially means I made up the title. I wanted to kind of live my life the way I wanted to live it. And I wanted to explore the things I want to explore. But probably more importantly, I really want to be part of making positive change in the world in any small way that I can. And for those of you that are watching this, you can see that I am a Black female. I was born here in the UK, and I've always had to think about what it means to be Black. And that said, of course, I live in a wider context. And a little while ago, I did a master's without doing an undergrad. And I came away really thinking about power. And I literally sat up bolt upright in my bed going, power permeates everything, like every conversation, the conversations between you and your friends, you and your kids, you and your boss, even negotiating public transport, like whichever way you think about it, power is there. And so I started this project, and I came up with the idea, Neurology of Power, because I wanted something that scientists would be interested in. I wanted something that business leaders would be interested in. I work in the cultural sector. I became obsessed with this idea that if you're leading, talking about art and culture, and you don't want to share power, why might that be? What if it was something that was integrated, but partly part of your brain? What if that was the logic? And so I called it Neurology of Power because I wanted something that was super cute as well, and that could live on a sweatshirt. So for me, you know, I'm not a scientist. I came to academia late. I'm more interested in a pair of trainers than anything else. And my measure of success is, do the academics, business people, but do people like me want to hear about this? So that's why I'm here. And then the pandemic hit, and there was a bit of a pivot. I started to think about people and identity, and how do we personally feel in a pandemic? How do we feel if we're furloughed, which for those of you listening outside of the UK is a UK thing where you were paid during the pandemic, but you were at home and you couldn't work? How do you feel if you've lost your job? How do you just feel if you haven't been able to integrate with family and friends in the same way? So hence the title of this, where we've kind of taken the big themes around inclusion and difference. Why are we all so het up if I'm a Brexit or a non-Brexit? Why are we het up about Boris Johnson or Trump or any of the global leaders? And so this really is a chance for us to sit and think in the context of neurology and power. Who are we as human beings? Why do we behave the way we do? And what parts do our brain and power have within that? And I always work collaboratively. Like, I think that's probably one of my only skills in life, is that I find super engaging people and I chat to them. And that's really what it is here. So I think let's move on. And what I think I'm going to do is just throw out a really basic, good question around how do we talk about power? So I guess if you're academic, how do you define power? But if you're me, if you're just kind of regular from Croydon, what does power mean to me? So I'm not going to give you an academic definition. I'm just going to say that when I think about it, I think about what am I able to do that I want to do, right? And what am I not able to do because I may not have recognized that I have power? And probably even more for me, like, how can I relate to power when I feel that someone else has it and they're doing things that I don't want? And so that's my definition. I think I'm going to go back the way that I started introducing people. So Tim, if you can just give us your quick definition for you of what power is.
Yeah, I think power, like you say, it's really hard to define, isn't it? And I think you can almost look at it in two ways, when you're maybe looking up and looking down, if that's the right way to think of it. You know, if you haven't got power, then you don't have choice. And I think what you said there, you know, bringing out power is a lot about choices. I choose to do this or I don't choose to do that. You know, I'm in control of things. So I think that control and choice is really important. But I think also you think of power. I think of myself, you know, you know, I'm a consultant neurologist now. So, you know, in many ways, that's a position of power, and I'm incredibly lucky and grateful to be doing that. But with that comes a lot of responsibility as well. So the buck stops with me. If I make a mistake, then it's, I have the power, but I also have the responsibility to get things right. So I think, yeah, power is really important to give to people, give people choice and decisions, but it doesn't come free. It comes with those responsibility and that weight and burden as well. So
Right.
that's how I sort of think about it.
Joy?
Coming from the US and really being raised here, I've had a very kind of myopic view of power. And I think a lot of Americans probably do. Like, we polarize ourselves based on whether we're white, we're Black, we're rich, we're poor, we're male or female. But what was interesting to me is, like, when I travel to other places where everybody looks the same, so the phenotype, everybody looks the same, you are still seeing power differences on the basis of tribal lines or religious lines. So it really made me think, oh, so power really doesn't have anything to do with race. It really doesn't have anything to do with, money. It is really just what you are able to do and what you're not able to do. So I look at power as the ability to do and be. It doesn't matter if you're a farmer in Bangladesh or, an African-American man who gets anxious when a cop car goes by. It is really about, are you able to do and realize what you want to do in life?
Wow, thank you. And Jerome?
Yeah, it's I think, to second what Tim and Joy are saying, for me, especially in the context of this conversation, it really comes down to our natural innate capacity to react and respond in a way that increases our chances of survival. This is realistically a case of the basic term of neuroplasticity. Do we have the capacity to change? Do we have the capacity to even recognize that we are in a position of influence or authority that we're using in a dominant way, or we're in a position of lack where we aren't being given the opportunity to do exactly what's just been described? So I think conceptually, it's just, what are we doing that allows us to move into a position to give ourselves a higher chance of survival? Is that a reaction that's involuntary? Is it a response that's voluntary? How are we exercising those spaces? And contextually, I think it's different. We've got to look at this from a case of saying, are we looking at mental power, especially on mental health awareness, the Worldwide Mental Health Day? Are we looking at it mentally, physically, emotionally, relationally, if it's a spiritual context for you? Because this could be different from a case of competence, a case of influence, a case of physical strength and capacity, or even a case of connection. Because when we look at power, the power of connection and relationship, especially what Joy was just talking, that transcends demographics and demarcations, it's really important to look at, am I having a conversation about physical capacity? Am I talking about a conversation of connection relationally? I think there's a lot of different ways to look at it, but at the end of the day, it comes down to, am I making a reactive choice that is increasing my chance of survival, or am I making a response that increases our chance of health and safety? And that will change the power dynamics pretty significantly.
Wow, thank you. So, I just want to sort of explain a little why I had you three here. For me, I think everything's interconnected. I'll talk a little bit more later about why I started with neuroscience when I thought about power. But what I was really, really been blown away by, well, firstly with you three, it's the fact that I'm not scared of talking to you. I don't feel like you're throwing kind of technical terms at me so much that I just don't get it. That's really important. But also there's this intersection, both in the way that you work and all of your values. And that brings me to this idea that when I thought about power, there are so many kind of interlocking areas around science. So Joy, we've talked about things like empathy, memory, creativity, confidence, reward, kind of thinking about, where do those things live? How do they relate? How are brain functions? How does our brain kind of deliver those things? And what happens when those functions go wrong? And Jerome, this idea of neuroplasticity, I'm absolutely fascinated with. Like, what can we change? What can't we change? Can we change being racist? Can we change how we view people with different beliefs? Can we change our own ability? So yeah, just what does our experience, how and what does our experience of power impact our own cognition? Jerome, do you have anything for that one?
Yeah, I think this is the beauty of what I see in private practice every day. I have a private clinical practice in Atlanta, and I specialize in complex unresolved cases. And one of the first things that I have to do with folks that come in, I mean, the folks that come in, I've attracted what my story is. It's an average of 20 specialists, over $100,000 US in care, and they may not even have an accurate diagnosis. And the reality is, so much of it is starting the conversation with de-identifying with a diagnosis, or de-identifying with what they've over-identified with, which is so much of a confirmation bias in so many different ways. But starting the conversation with saying, if we don't understand that we're innately capable of change, even on a genetic level, even on a hardware level, the idea of even entering into the conversation of saying, can I recognize that person of a different race as an equal, equitable human? Well, if I can't even consider my capacity to change a real thing, then the likelihood of me engaging in the conversation is different. And this is, I think, one of the things just to encourage everybody in terms of a realistic space. I specialize in nonverbal autism and traumatic brain injury and movement disorders. And when you have somebody who is at 72 years old get out of a wheelchair within 6 months when they've been wheelchair bound for 5 years, or somebody who's 11 starts speaking within 6 months, and those are through really practical interventions, this is moving it out of the idea of voodoo, pseudoscience, magic, mystical kind of spaces to going, the reason that works is if we understand that we functionally, realistically have the capacity for change, and then we're starting with that mindset of who we can become. I think it moves us away from the conversation of saying how we're changing the narrative from being less broken to becoming more whole. And I think that's really the context of what we're looking at, is saying, I don't want to remind you of how broken things are. I want to remind you of the capacity to become whole. And that has to start with giving people the freedom and the capacity and the opportunity to realize that change is relevant, not just in an esoteric way, but in a really legitimate, practical, neurological, neuroscientific, and tangible way. I think it's very doable.
So I have a question. Anyone who knows me, I'm really annoying. I'm like, but why? But why? And why again? So what actually happens in our brain? In terms, what is neuroplasticity? How do we make those changes? And that's, maybe you start off, and then Tim or Joy, you might want to come in after that.
Sure, I'd love to hear from everybody as well. I always joke around with everybody. A really easy way to understand functional neurology and how it can change is just to take your two hands, to interlock them, and just notice which thumb is on top. For me, it's my left. And then just switch hands, put the other thumb on top, and see how that feels, right? You're just interlocking your own hands. Unless you're missing a finger, these should be pretty symmetrical, right? But you put one thumb on top, you switch hands, and you put the other thumb on top. Some people will actually have a visceral reaction. It will feel so strange. And what's happening is the neuroplasticity is your brain is going, this is what feels comfortable. You just changed the environment and changed my confirmation bias. You changed the way that I normally, and confirmation bias just means the way you normally respond to what you're familiar with. What's your narrative? What's your history? What's your protocol? And we're talking about, I feel uncomfortable quickly in my own body with my own hands, and all I did was change position. So when we're talking about neuroplasticity, it's just a case of being able to look at it and say, how quickly does my brain recognize a change in the environment? And is it able to recognize that that's either safe or unsafe, and how does it respond? So one other point that I would make is, you can't tell yourself, this is a really classic way of looking at neuroplasticity, that your brain has a different feedback loop. So why is it that when somebody touches the bottom of my foot, I can respond in this really profound, strong way to that input, but if I touch my own foot, it doesn't happen? The reality of that is being able to say there is different context based on who's exercising power, who's bringing the information in, do I have a sense of control, and what do I do with that? And from a neuroplasticity point, we won't go into it for the sake of the time, but it takes me, even if somebody's got about 30 to 40 years of ticklishness, you can get rid of their ticklishness from a sensory input standpoint on average in about 90 seconds to a minute and a half. So it's very easy to do, because you just have to get somebody to understand that they're safe, and that input hasn't changed, just their perception of the input has changed.
Wow. So I'm just going to repeat that question. Sort of, how does our experience of power impact our cognition? Joy or Tim, either which one of you wants to jump in?
I can jump
Joy?
in. Um, well, I would say overall, when we feel powerless, that can present in a lot of different ways. We might be angry, we might be depressed, we might be delusional. And the brain, I'm really finding out more and more, the brain is really crafty in its way to try to protect us, right? So if we're talking about post-traumatic stress disorder, and you feel powerless, it may cause you to forget entire portions of your life or make you hyper vigilant so that you feel like you have to fight everything. If it's a dissociative identity disorder, you maybe went through horrendous trauma as a child, it may create an alter ego for you that will fight for you and who will defend you. I mean, if you're narcissistic, it might just, create a whole universe for you where you are always right and you can never be wrong so that it protects you. I mean, the reality is the brain is always trying to do this, but it's very selfish. It's not thinking the long term. It's not thinking long end goals. It's really thinking, how can I keep myself alive now? And so sometimes that is not necessarily working for us. So we have to kind of question these beliefs and question these behaviors so that we can make sure that we are headed in the direction we want to go.
Wow, thank you. And Tim?
Yeah, I think that's a really good description, and just like maybe sort of to add a bit more sort of neurobiology to that. I think sometimes I think of the brain as just a sort of big guessing machine. It's guessing what you're going to do, and it has this little prediction. So okay, this happens, I'm going to do this, and that's sort of what you're going to do is based on lots of different things. Sometimes it's genetic things; these things are a bit inbuilt. But a lot of it is based on experience, and as Joy and Jerome has said, you modify those sort of predictions, and those guesses, and those actions based on new experiences, yeah, a lot of those. I mean, the way that the brain learns that and fine tunes it is very complicated. It involves a lot of brain regions. But very old brain regions as well. So this bit called the basal ganglia, which is right in the middle of the brain, one of the oldest bits of the brain, is there to fine tune our actions and our predictions and what we do. So when we're talking about power and those sort of experiences we have, well, those powerful those experiences of power, if you like, sort of perception of power, is sort of fine tuning those predictions of what the brain is going to do next through all these sort of complex fine tuning mechanisms. So yeah, it's really sort of fascinating how that works. And I think one thing Joy particularly touched on, feeling sort of depression or anxiety and things which get in the way. And so a lot of people who come to our clinic with memory problems, they haven't got anything wrong with they haven't got a dementia or anything like that, but that whole system of attention and taking things in is just overwhelmed. That sort of working memory system is overwhelmed with thinking about their tough situation in life, their depression, their anxiety, and it's stopping them learning, and it's stopping them being able to sort of fine tune those processes and predictions which we were talking about, because this working memory system is so clogged up with thinking about the depression or the anxiety or whatever else is going on in life.
Can I jump in? I really like what you're just saying. One of the things I like to do with my patients, I like to ask them, what would you do? What would you do if you could not fail? What would you try if you could not fail? Just think about that for a moment.
Great question.
And I guarantee the moment you start to think about that, all of the barriers start to come in. So your amygdala, which Suzanne loves, that's her favorite part of the brain. The amygdala, which is the fear center, is like, oh, but what if you fail? Like, why are we going to do this? This doesn't feel right, And then, the hippocampus, which is like your memory center, is bringing up all the facts and the statistics like, well, the probability of you really being able to do this, I'm not really sure, right? Then, you have the frontal lobes which are here in the front. That's your executive function. That's where, you strategize and you plan, so your frontal lobes are firing and trying to figure out like, could we do this? Like, is this a possibility? So I think this is part of why it could be important to understand some of these basic pathways or basic parts of the brain, so that when you are making some of these decisions, kind of what's working for you, what's working against you. You know, the brain is always either working for you or against you. And then you can learn to kind of, you know, maybe hack that, you know, maybe through biofeedback. You know, biofeedback is the ability to use the brain to kind of monitor or to change things in the body. Like with your brain, you can lower your heart rate, you know. I see Jerome smiling. I know he knows all about that, and Tim as well. But this is also why neuroplasticity is so exciting. You know, back in the day, we thought your brain is what it is, and if it got damaged, that was it. You know, but now we know that there's the hippocampus is creating new connections and pathways, and it's so exciting. It's like the brain is the final frontier, you know?
Can I add something quick, Suzanne?
Yeah.
You know, I think for everybody who's listening who doesn't have as much of a background, that you may be a patient or family member, one of the analogies that I use that I think intersects everything that Joy and Tim are talking about is the entire experience of being a human and using your brain is like navigating your environment. It's a case of using a GPS, using all of the information in the car. But think of the most advanced car on the planet, and that's just it's just touching the capacity of what the brain has. So when we're talking about neuroplasticity, it's not this huge thing of saying, do I have to change vehicles? Do I have to change states? Do I have to change interstates? Think of it as whatever region you're in that you navigate. It's your highway, it's your interstate, it's your neighborhood. And all we're talking about is saying that 95 to 97% of what's happening to us is subconscious, which means that we're on autopilot. Very rarely does it actually get to the real estate that's saying, am I aware? And am I making a decision based on that awareness? And the reason I say that is to understand that so much of this is working on autopilot. So much of this is working in the background. So much of this is kind of the Tesla on auto drive, is because the way the brain works is to help us survive. It's not going to push back about the health of what we're doing. It's going to push back about the viability of what we're doing. So when we take a day like today around mental health and we give ourselves the opportunity to normalize what's happening, the point that I'm making is whether you're talking about depression, anxiety, panic attacks, significant diagnoses, PTSD, the majority of the time, the brain is just trying to help get you somewhere or get you away from somewhere. It's trying to achieve some degree of where it hits the gas. And like Tim was talking about in the basal ganglia, it's got some really fascinating ways of hitting the gas, hitting the brakes, or hitting cruise control and being like, how do we get there? How do we get away from it? How do we back up? How do we just hit cruise and maintain the resources that we have? And I think for that being the case, one of the things that I would love to normalize for people that are listening is that, you know, anxiety is understandable. It's just not sustainable. Depression is understandable. It's just not sustainable. Panic attacks and all of these other spaces are understandable. They're just not sustainable. Because when you talk about anxiety, that's unrestrained, unrelenting concern. Concern is a really good thing. We should have that. Depression is unrelenting sadness and disappointment and grief. You know, my wife and I have lost 3 out of 4 of our parents. I've attempted suicide twice. Unfortunately didn't succeed. The spaces that we're in, where we're in those places, oftentimes we miss the narrative that it is understandable. It just may not be sustainable. So when we're talking about this, it's a case of becoming aware, moving out of autopilot and go, maybe the best thing that I can do today is just change lanes or just change speeds. But I don't know how to necessarily get off the highway and make an exit, or get on the right highway and make an on-ramp. Maybe it's just a case of becoming aware and just recognizing that I even exist in the space that I'm in, rather than judging it, just holding space for it and saying that the neuroplasticity is first and foremost just becoming aware of it. Maybe the best thing that you can do is just take a deep breath and go, wow, I haven't changed anything in my environment, but the fact that I became aware and changed my normal reaction to just breathe first and pause, you have effectively executed not only working with the CEO in your brain, but making a choice to go, I can survive long enough to have a single deep breath. And so I think normalizing some of the experiences we're having first and foremost is also a really important conversation to have, because so much of the fear that happens around our diagnoses traps us from making a change in where we are naturally oriented.
Wow, thank you.
Love that, Jerome.
Thank you.
Tim, I'm gonna just come to you for a couple of things. So first of all, I just want to say this. So I'm pretty sure that anyone who was listening did this and this, right?
Yeah.
And when my non-dominant finger went over, I literally felt a wave of anxiety like rise up. I mean, not a mad amount, but enough. And Tim, you and I have been talking about kind of circling back round and bringing it back to this idea of power, right? And as we know, just from my research, we don't exactly know where power resides in the brain. But if just doing this with your hands can have such a dramatic effect, like this idea of power and this either feeling of power or not having power or feeling that other people have exercised power over you. How do we start thinking about that? We talked about a paper that talked about empathy, and how, you know, there's some research by a really brilliant academic who talks about this idea that whilst we're looking for where and trying to think about where power resides in the brain, what we do know is that he's done some studies, and there have been studies around this relationship between empathy and power. What can you tell us about that, just from those papers that you and I looked at together?
Yeah, I think yeah, empathy is a good way into thinking about power, because I think power is such a hard concept to sort of try and track down. There's lots of elements to it, and yeah, I mean, there's this sort of system in the brain called the mirror neuron system. So if you're, and this particularly in the movement world, if you're trying to copy a movement, then this mirror system lights up. And that helps you to learn how to do something. And there's some thought that actually that same mirror system might help us in empathy. In if we see someone else who's in a particular state, then we can empathize that with this mirror neuron system. And there's a bit of evidence to support that. There's very little on sort of power itself, but people have started to link some of these ideas of emotion and how we control emotion to some of the large brain networks. That is the sort of thing that I look at, and there's this concept of emotion regulation. So can we control our emotions and regulate them in some ways? And there's two components to that. One is the emotion suppression. So if you're just broken up with your girlfriend, for example, or boyfriend, you feel really sad. Can you somehow suppress that emotion to make yourself feel a bit better? And the other part is cognitive reappraisal. So can I think about that in a different way? So, well, actually, maybe I wasn't, shouldn't have been with that person anyway. And you sort of get through it that way. And there's a bit of evidence, particularly this emotion suppression, is linked to how efficient your brain is and specific networks within your brain. So there are these networks which come on and offline depending on what we're doing. And one really important one is called the default mode network. And it's called the default mode network because it's the one that sort of, if we're not doing much, that comes online. And that seems to be involved in some way in controlling our emotions and being able to suppress our emotions. So if we're trying to sort of link this concept of power and emotion and being in control and being able to regulate our emotions in some way, then that's probably the place to start looking. Because you're right, I think Joy was right to mention the amygdala and fear, and that's one component of it. There's this whole system called the limbic system, which again is a very old system in the brain. It's been there for a long time, and the fact I think that it's been there for so long, and it's so much involved in our emotions, just tells us how important emotions and feeling are to us as humans and to how we work. We're very social animals. That's what we do. And that's what we're good at. So I think looking in this limbic system, trying to understand emotion, trying to understand how we can control that through these large brain networks is one way to try and tackle that. But I think we're a long way from really properly understanding and having real answers for how power is represented in the brain.
Wow. Okay. Thank you. So, I mean, I could just sit and talk to you all day, and I might just try and trap you in a Zoom room somewhere forever. But for the moment, I want to kind of move on a little and start thinking about us as individuals and this idea of a pandemic and power. I think I certainly know that every time someone asks me how I am every day, and I'm like, I kind of don't know. But what I do know is that I don't know quite what power is, but sometimes I feel a little less of it. I definitely feel this idea that it's affected by my environment and by what I can and can't do. And so, Tim, starting off with you, like, what just like in what way might a pandemic do something, or how does it work with our brains? What are we feeling and why?
Yeah, I think it's going to mess with us in all sorts of ways, to be honest, because it's something new and unexpected. Whenever the brain comes across something it hasn't come across before, we come across something we haven't come across before. That makes us scared, and that makes us worried. And you mentioned the amygdala earlier, and that's where some of that sort of fear is located. And the amygdala is really important because it uses our emotions to fine tune our response to things. So if you're feeling scared, then it's going to stop you being able to fine tune your responses in the right way. So I think just because it's something big and scary, that's going to affect how we feel about things and our sense of power. But I think more than that, the experiences that people have gone through, whether that's losing a job, having to take on more work in some cases, bereavement, seeing people around us who are bereaved or suffering, or just seeing this daily constant bad news, even if it's not affected us directly. I think that's going to shape us. And also what I haven't quite got my head around yet is this lack of social engagement as well, and how social engagement has changed. We're used to a large part of the normal festival this year is about touch. That's sort of disappeared, and that's gone in many ways. So I think how we interact socially has changed. The news that we see has changed, and how we perceive it is a lot more negative, I think. And then people's experiences are all going to have an impact on our brains and our emotions and our ability to sort of feel powerful.
Wow. So Joy and Jerome, I know you both kind of have thoughts about this. Joy, we've sort of talked about individuals and communities and power and panic and disassociation. So I'm going to come to you in a minute to kind of talk about that. But Jerome, we've had some really interesting ideas around the brain and discomfort and pain and life-threatening situations and trauma. Can you kind of use that to kind of talk to us a little bit about how that might affect how we're behaving and feeling during a pandemic?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is one of the interesting spaces as a species, as a human condition, to understand, regardless of whether or not I live in the UK, I live in the US, I'm anywhere in the world, whatever our segregating demographic is. I tell people whatever box you check on a tax form, you take all of that away, every human being on the planet, your central nervous system functions in a very, very similar way in terms of how it's trying to survive. So when we're looking at a space like the pandemic, first and foremost, we can understand that the common ground is everybody is going to have a different response and a different reaction to whether or not this is triggering and to what degree it is triggering. But the reality is, when we get triggered as human beings, because it's a speed, it's an efficiency, it's a speed of response situation for survival. When we get triggered, all of us are going to revert to the 7-year-old version of ourselves very quickly. And if it increases in intensity, we're going to revert to an even more primal, more animalistic version of ourselves. I joke around with all of my families that I work with that if you're familiar with Marvel, the comic book series, and the Hulk, Bruce Banner and the Hulk, this really fancy thing that we call our frontal lobe and all of our executive function and our cognitive capacity, our ability to control ourselves. That's like Bruce Banner. You actually have two, one on the left and one on the right. But then all of us have a Hulk, and we actually got two Hulks, both sides of our midbrain, and this whole fancy thing called the Limbic System. It's a fancy way of saying, did I show up as this calm, collected scientist, or this person who's capable of empathy and emotional intelligence, or did I get triggered and did I Hulk out? Well, when we're talking about the pandemic, everybody is going to Hulk out in a very, very different way based on a lifetime of lived experiences. Growing up, was it more likely for you to minimize pain and increase what you enjoyed and what was pleasurable, to minimize risk and increase reward if you ran away, if you hid, if you disassociated? Did you have more of a likelihood of survival if you just shut down and you played dead and you froze and you stopped being a viable thing for somebody to impact or to abuse? Or did you find out, man, the best way that I can survive is to become a bigger version of the bear, to be a bigger Hulk than you are, and you decided to fight, and that's the way you engaged? Well, if you look at everybody in the spaces of the pandemic, they're going to have varying degrees of this fight, flight, or freeze response, this intensity, this disconnected, this disassociation. But realistically, it's one of those rare opportunities in history that we're seeing that the global community is experiencing a limbic response. It's experiencing this limbic attachment. You know, for us in the US, it's where were you when 9/11 happened, or the Challenger blew up, or JFK gets shot. Every culture has their limbic experiences, these really powerful, memorable moments that the brain went, wow, that's insane, that's intense. And the reason I mention that is if we start having a conversation with each other in terms of the pandemic and in terms of power and equity and diversity and inclusion, and we're looking at each other and we go, can I ask myself and ask of you, that response or that reaction happened because for some degree or for some reason you didn't feel safe, or for some reason you made that choice or had that reaction in an autopilot way because you felt it increases your chances of safety and survival. Why? Asking that clarifying question about what about that response or reaction helped you to feel more safe is a really great way for us. I joke around with folks being in the Bible Belt here in the Southeast. When I immigrated to the States, we did not know that there were so many denominations in the States. But when we got to the Southeast and somebody said, you know, what does it look like for you to be a Christian? It's my background. I didn't realize in the States they were asking that there are 7,000 ways that that could be. But the reason I say that to just give a bullet point as a connection there, one of the phrases that I use for folks when we're having a conversation to hold space for both sides of the conversation around Trump, politics, a lot of other spaces, is I think the reason that you either love or hate Trump is he looks a lot like the God you grew up with. What I mean by that is a lot of folks are going to be in a space where they either feel very connected and safe with this person in this position of authority because they model what they've grown up with, or they're going to feel very unsafe because that space that they grew up in doesn't feel good for them anymore. And that's just a context point. But why I say that is as we're talking about safety and we're talking about pandemic, being able to recognize that we're all going to Hulk out, how quickly can Bruce Banner step back into the conversation and help us to self-regulate is a really good way to recognize that people just feel unsafe. And we can either reinforce that or we can mitigate that for ourselves and other people around us.
Cool. So I'm about to go to Joy, but I just want to check in with one more thing with you. So we've talked about this idea of that as a human being, you're constantly trying to work out. You talked about something being more of or less than. We talked about this idea that sometimes it isn't about a win; it's just less of a loss.
Absolutely.
And how would that work in this kind of situation of a pandemic?
It's a great chance to honor that everybody's self-gratification and survival strategy is going to be very, very different. You know, one of the phrases that I used when we talked is we have to be able to look at it and go, am I concerned about losing my life or am I concerned about losing my way of life? Because in that situation, honoring the difference between a Black and a white experience in the US, you know, me as I give it as context as a pain patient, a chronic pain patient. I have zero lived experience as a Black person or an African American. I do as poor, I do as immigrant, I do as somebody that's been experienced a ton of bigotry in the Southeast for being an immigrant. But what I mean by that is that as a patient, I can go, and for instance, I've had 75 migraines this year. I wouldn't wish that on anybody. If next year I have 20 migraines, that by comparison is not a rewarding year, it's a less painful year. So next year feels more life-giving by comparison because I can either mitigate pain and feel more life, or I can pursue pleasure. So when we're talking about this pandemic situation, it's hard to understand and it's a bigger conversation for a longer context, but some people are just trying to keep the pain level at a manageable space. They're just trying to say, if I get pulled over, I just don't want to get shot. It doesn't mean that I want to walk out of my door and win the lottery. It doesn't mean that I want to walk out of my door and have everything given to me. It means I just don't want to experience any more pain than I have in my own life, generationally or culturally. That's a very different conversation to say, how do we honor the space that some people find it life-giving just to minimize pain, and other people find it life-giving to not lose what it is that they want. So when you see a population like white privilege and white power in these conversations around equity, it's a very different space for folks who are in a white community to understand that you are having a conversation where you're having a life-threatening response, you're overreacting in an inordinate way, but what you're concerned about is losing your way of life, not your actual life. So we can find some equitable spaces to go, we're both being triggered, but are we being triggered because something is actually life-threatening, or being triggered because we perceive losing our way of life to be life-threatening? And it's kind of ways to have a conversation around that.
Wow. So Joy, let me bring you in here around that idea of kind of, what is this pandemic doing to our brains from more of a kind of your perspective, and you're based in hospital, you work with people, as you talk about, you're talking about well-being. So I guess what would your response be to this?
Well, I think it's really important to extend grace to ourselves during this time. I don't know who said it was the best of times or it was the worst of times. It sounds like it should be said with a British accent, so maybe maybe it was a Brit. I don't know, but yeah, I feel like, it is a time where there's just so much uncertainty. We don't have a blueprint for what's happening, and every day things are changing so quickly. We're just trying to adjust and keep up. Um, but I think also what can happen is when you're in this state of just survival, you forget to dream. You forget to have hopes, or to strive for something bigger because you're really just trying to get your next meal. And then also, we've seen also how society can destabilize so quickly, you know, within days or hours. People are fighting over toilet paper. Whoever thought we would fight over toilet paper, or be suspicious of their neighbor, shoot your neighbor because you don't like the way they think. So I think in a time like this, you recognize that there are always choices. There's always a decision you can make. There's post-traumatic stress, and then there's post-traumatic growth. You can always decide, this is a crazy situation. How can I best adjust? How can I adapt to this? Is there an opportunity? We tend to look at all the bad things that are happening, but it has launched us into this realm where we can have conversations like this all around the globe at the same time. It's broadening conversation. So I think being able to see the opportunities that exist in this time is really important. And then also being able to self-soothe in a way that's healthy, being able to speak life and hope over yourself. It may not look like I'm going to get out of debt, but I can. It may be really difficult for me to stop drinking alcohol, but I can do it. I did it before. Why can't I do it again? I mean, there's something that happens to the brain when we speak things. And this is not a new concept. This is a very ancient concept. In the Bible, it says life and death is in the power of the tongue, or as a man thinketh, so is he. So people have known about this forever. But something happens when you say something, your brain's like, oh, well, you're right. Maybe I can do this. Let's try. So I really work with my patients on really speaking life into their existence, speaking good things, speaking positivity in the midst of so much chaos. It's really important that we do that.
Wow. So you and I have talked a little about this idea of communities who feel that they don't have power. And can you share that experience that we've talked about previously around this idea of what happens in the brain if you are constantly put in positions where you don't have power?
I think on a very basic level, you become very fearful. You're fearful of losing the little bit of power that you have. You're fearful of who's around you, who can take it. But then eventually you become depressed. And so you just find yourself with a motivation. Like you don't feel like doing anything. You're like, why try? I don't have any power or capacity to do what I want to do. Why should I even try? And then that is just, that's it's all downhill from there, if you can't start to pull yourself back up. And so I find that that's what we're seeing. We're seeing suicide rates skyrocket, just skyrocket in the last few months. We're seeing substance abuse increase. We're seeing domestic violence. Like people are really like grasping at whatever, just trying to, sustain themselves. And that's kind of exactly what I'm talking about, is being able to kind of get out of the amygdala, get out of the fear-based part of your brain, and really stay in the Bruce Banner part, the executive function part of your brain, where you can really think and you can really strategize, like, what is going to be the best thing for not just now, but for 5 years from now or 10 years from now, because I'm going to think that I'm going to be around in 5 years or 10 years. You know, there's something about just speaking that and thinking that way.
Oh, wow. Thank you. So I want to kind of link some of those ideas and move us on a little bit. So really some of the things that we've learned are this idea that the brain moves from kind of discomfort to pain to life-threatening to trauma very quickly. I'm going to come to Jerome and then Tim. Jerome, we talked a lot about this idea of taking a breath. Like, if you can take a breath in that moment, you almost talk to your brain and your brain goes, okay, well, if something's happening and I can take a breath, then it can't be as bad as I thought it was. And this idea that your brain doesn't necessarily recognize the difference between a bear coming along and potentially biting your head off versus a little bit of, and maybe not so much a little bit, but that idea of just being in conflict with someone. And how does that work around power, and what does that do?
Yeah, I think, the biggest thing in those spaces is, how do we keep coming back to the best resource that we have, which Joy just mentioned, which is decision making, the capacity to make a decision, to have a choice. Because if I get triggered, we got to realize the Hulk and Bruce Banner are the same person. They're just different in context. They're not two separate people. That's all in us. It's that frontal lobe warring against that brainstem. That in this situation, the faster that I can get back to a space and recognize, if this is not a life-threatening situation, it is not a life-threatening situation. But if your brain perceives it to be, it's going to kickstart a completely different process and protocol. Because if you're under the impression that you're about to die, the idea of taking a deep breath of a bear is chasing you is irrational. It's irrational. There is no rationale. So being able to do something simple like take a deep breath or take a sip of water, or just check in, do something somatically, where even if you can't have proximity with other touch, to touch yourself. Our sensory system is profound. To just put my hands on my own chest. I mean, we just saw it. We touched our own hands, switched hands, and we freaked ourselves out, right? So it's one of those things where if we're in a place to be able to go, there is no bear, I'm not going to get eaten. I mean, think of the last time that you were truly running late for a flight, either at LAX or, for me, it's in Hartsfield-Jackson. And what's the airport in England? I forget.
In Heathrow.
But in Heathrow, right? If you're running late for a flight, you genuinely are going to miss that flight. You are under the impression that you're going to die. The reality is most of the time that's not true. So if we can take a deep breath, because my point is if we're looking at the basics like hydration and sleep and rest and movement and breathing and what we eat, there is never going to be a time that we get triggered that it is not tied to a lack of resources and fatigue. It's not possible. If the trigger is profound, we can burn through all of our resources in a moment. But a majority of the time, if I'm triggered and I feel like there's a bear chasing me, did I sleep enough? Did I hydrate? Am I taking a deep breath? Have I been holding my breath in this conversation because I don't feel safe necessarily? But for me to stop if I was actually being chased by a bear and go, for 6 seconds, I either just got eaten or I realized nothing's about to eat me, right? So this is the power. And this is also that autonomy, that agency, that self-advocacy to go, there's nothing in this situation. And here's the exception. And I want to be really, really clear about this. Communities that are actually in danger of being killed. And in the States, we've seen this year so evidently, that to be in a situation where I ask someone to take a deep breath when they are legitimately afraid for their life is unfair, and it's not empathetic, it's not trauma informed. The other side of that conversation is to go, if the 99.9% of the time that you are not actually in a life-threatening situation, you can simply take a deep breath, it will take your brain and de-escalate it from DEFCON 5 survival strategy, life-threatening environments to go, what's the next best choice I can make? Because the first choice is not to answer any questions or to fix anything or even to comprehensively understand. It's just to check and to check in and to exercise agency and power in my own body to go, can I at least just take the power of that single deep breath to check back in and go from there at minimum? And that will de-escalate a lot of the intensity and the severity, move us just a little bit back up to where Bruce Banner is. And it's going to vacillate. You're going to be competing with it. You know, to quote scripture, like Dr. Joy just mentioned, the spirit wars against the flesh. It's just the frontal lobe warring against that part of the brainstem that goes, am I safe? And if I can go, I might not be comfortable, I might not feel good, but I've at least let my brain know I'm not in a life-threatening situation anymore. So let me just check back in for just a second.
Cool. I'm going to open it up. We're going to kind of move to the final section now. I want to kind of broaden that out a bit and talk about this idea of resilience and power, but also communities and difference. This idea that we can just almost viscerally dislike a group of people because of either their beliefs or how they look. And I wonder how we approach difference and diversity when we're kind of thinking about power and what might be happening in our brain. I will literally throw that open. It's kind of like a game show. Who puts their hand up first?
I can have a go. I think it's hard to sort of point, you know, you can't point to a picture of the brain and say, well, you know, this is the racist bit of the brain, for example. But I think it gets back to, you know, that brain being a sort of prediction instrument, if you like. So it makes guesses, and those guesses are informed by our previous experience. And if you're told, you know, as you're growing up, you know, I grew up in a pretty racist area. And you know, I didn't inherit those beliefs. Well, why was that? Well, it's because I was told at home, you know, these are the values that you should have. So, you know, some of my friends did grow up because, you know, with racist beliefs, because that was what they were sort of fed every day, and that fed into those brain systems. It went through those basal ganglia mechanisms we talked about earlier to fine tune those responses in those certain situations. And, you know, if your gut response is going to be, I don't like this person because they're different from me, you know, they're white, they're black, they're whatever, they're different. Well, you know, that's going to be based on those experiences. So how do we counter that? Well, it's not going to be an immediate thing. So it's not going to be pointing a gun at someone and saying, you shouldn't think that. Well, you know, of course, that's not going to change the way you feel, because it's not in a you know, in a relaxed environment where you're responsive to things, where your brain is responsive to things. So, you know, you see a lot. I think this is one of the challenges with social media. You see a lot of emotion expressed on social media, trying to change people's minds. Well, I'm not convinced myself that that's, you know, the right environment where people are going to actually sit down and think carefully and considerately about what's being put there, because often it's being put with a lot of emotion attached to it, and to make people feel bad. Actually, what you want to do is sit down and have conversations. And you see these sort of little new videos on news websites where, you know, someone meets their troll or something, and actually they sit down and they realize they've got more in common than they realize, you know. And I remember being at the Folkestone Festival a couple of years ago, sitting down with an anti-vaccine person, and that's obviously a long way from where I am. And we had this very heated conversation for about 5 minutes. And then we got onto other topics, and we realized actually we have a lot in common. And I think that's how you get people to understand and change their mind and change their perception. It's a slow retraining of these gut feelings, these gut responses of the brain. So that, I think, is how we tie that in with neurobiology.
I like that, Tim. Oh, can I just jump in really quickly? I really feel that conversation is the key. You know, like here in the US, you know, there's a lot of, you know, there's right versus left. But when you look at, you know, what is really truly important to people, you know, whether you're a Trump supporter, whether you're a Black Lives Matter activist, I mean, there are basic needs. You want to take care of your family. You want to be able to be comfortable. You want to be healthy. I mean, and so there are so many places where we do overlap. And if we can sit and have conversations and find ways to respect a difference in opinion, as long as they're not, you know, taking away my rights, as long as they're not making me feel unsafe. You know, I think that there should be some space for that. You know, when I go in the street, I always look like this, you know, some version of this, right? Maybe a different color head wrap. But when I see kids, it's really interesting when you know, see little infants or toddlers, you know, they kind of sit back because this could be a little jarring for them. They've never seen somebody that looks like me. But then you see their brain kind of trying to take it in, like, okay, well, is this person safe? You know, then I'll maybe smile or I'll do a little, and they're like, oh, okay, this person's okay. This person's a lot like me in a lot of ways. You know, maybe they look a little different, but they're a lot like me. So I think if we can get back to that kind of childlike, you know, curiosity, but then respect that this person's not really trying to harm me, you know, they just are different. And find ways to respect that and honor that, I think we'll be in a much better place, you know, going forward. I know it sounds idealistic. It sounds very like small world after all, but I think it is possible. And we do it on some level.
Wow.
Absolutely.
Jerome,
And
Jerome, can
just
I?
to add,
Sorry, go on,
go
Jerome.
ahead. I was just going to add to that quickly with both what Tim and Joy said, and you know, I think realistically, I would love to shift it, even though it feels idealistic, to going, you know, if we're taking on really, really profoundly complex things, practicality and pragmatism is a really, really healthy approach. We may not be able to be optimistic. We certainly want to try to avoid just sheer, you know, unhealthy pessimism. But if I have somebody coming in with something profound, like all of us do, I mean, Tim's dealing with very difficult demographics and Joy's dealing with very difficult demographics. If we can't be pragmatic, then what in the world are we doing in terms of charting a course to navigate an effective outcome for somebody? You know, but to combine the neurobiology and what Joy was saying, I think this is both metaphorically and literally like walking. We're walking ourselves through a conversation. You know, Ram Dass says we're all just trying to walk each other home. And I joke with folks when I'm dealing with movement disorders that walking is nothing more than a controlled series of falls. And so it's pretty much everything else in life. Okay. So when we're talking about this, none of us look at kids who are learning to walk. My son turned 5 yesterday. I've got a 2.5-year-old and a 3-week-old. Watching them all learn to walk is a vastly fascinating thing. And my metaphorical piece to tie this in and go, well, how do we engage in these conversations and realize what it looks like? I think as adults, as capable human beings, we anticipate that we're going to have so much finesse and so much skill at doing this. If you've never walked through this kind of conversation on equity or white power or injustice or systematic racism, that is like trying to walk when you are an infant in these conversations. It's going to be messy. It's going to be difficult. You're going to do a lot more falling and a lot more stumbling. So I think part of it is to combine this idea of power and pandemic is most of us are engaging in this conversation. And like an infant, we're using a lot of power, but we don't have a lot of finesse. And the only way that we develop finesse is we have to practice. This is not a conversation about capacity. It's a conversation about utilization. We have the capacity to be healthy in these spaces, to navigate them, to have finesse and to balance what we're doing metaphorically and literally. But it's going to be difficult until it isn't, because it's unpracticed. So we have to be willing to be uncomfortable, develop some degree of stamina and capacity, and then properly and effectively utilize that strength in a way that exercises restraint. Because it's like going into the gym with somebody who's got a ton of power, but no restraint. That's what most leadership is at this point. And the problem is that we're confusing authority with competence. And that's not the same thing, right? So to have authority and to have competence is also realizing that you can very quickly overpower somebody. I, as an adult, can overpower my 2.5-year-old. She doesn't have the same practice as I do. So if I've got the capacity and I'm also exercising the competence, I can extend that grace and that compassion and that empathy to the other person who may not be there yet because they're still stumbling pretty through all of this. And I think that's some of the space to realize it's okay to fall down. That's the nature of developing the skills. That's okay.
Cool. So, you know, Jerome, we talked about this idea about uncomfortable conversations giving us stamina, and you likened it to tearing a muscle when you're kind of in the gym trying to do something new. And I think if we think about that, then sitting with that discomfort becomes something different. And you talked about this idea that you kind of have to know how long you're going to be in pain for. Like, can you just talk us through that idea very quickly?
Yeah, absolutely. It's my shorthand definition of resilience is knowing the difference between discomfort and trauma. And the difference between discomfort and trauma is the length of time for recovery. So if I go into the gym, I used to be 315 pounds when I graduated high school. And my identical twin brother was 85 pounds lighter than me, which is an entertaining conversation when you've got somebody who's 85 pounds lighter than you and they are identical. But when I started going into the gym, if I go into the gym and I go into that CrossFit gym that somebody got a weekend certification and they decide they want me to do a box jump and I've never done that and I fall off and I hit my head, the length of time for recovery is going to be significantly different than if I go in with a trainer and they say, let's take it in a way that's going to be manageable for you relative to your lived experience and where you currently are. This is the nature of a good therapist, spiritual director, counselor, doctor. Everybody's pacing it based on your particular environment. But I would be in a very bad situation if the person who is my therapist or my counselor or my support team didn't tell me to anticipate being uncomfortable. Because if I'm going to grow and I'm going to develop, I cannot actually build muscle mass without having a microfiber tear in the muscle, because I have to build some capacity to bear weight more effectively. So when I work out, if I'm sore for 2 to 3 days, that is very understandable. But if I'm sore for weeks or months or years, or I tear a tendon off of a bone because somebody pushed me too hard, that's trauma. So I think when we're going through these conversations and we're engaging in them, recognizing a level of discomfort and even a level of soreness emotionally, relationally, mentally, and physically, and even spiritually in these spaces, that if it hurts for less than a week, it is not trauma. If it hurts for less than a day, it is definitely not trauma. But being able to go back to that and go, can I manage this and get through it and get, especially if I need support, if I can't get through it on my own and I'm doing a regular workout, what does it look like for me to have a coach and to have a trainer and to have a support team? I think more than anything, it's being able to very quickly cue in and go, am I avoiding this because I don't want to be uncomfortable? And if you think about it, most people get into the gym for the first time at the beginning of the year and they're 15 minutes into their first workout. What's generally the thing that everybody's going to say? I feel like I'm dying. You're not dying. You feel like you're dying. But if we know that that discomfort is par for the course and even par for healthy development, and last point, just to make quickly, the beautiful thing with this space, especially in the physiology of the way that the body works, I am not responsible for my trigger. I'm responsible for becoming aware of it and how I respond to it. But the recovery process is actually, fortunately, not my responsibility either. I can foster an environment that gives me a higher likelihood of recovery. But if I tear a muscle, if I scrape my hand, I'm not responsible for sitting there and making sure that that skin renews itself. I'm responsible for not impacting that environment to make it any worse. But if I get triggered and I can become aware of it, then I can choose a single response, even if that response is only to breathe, and then trust that my body is so beautifully made and equipped to start the recovery process for me and continue it without me. Then I start to decrease my likelihood of going, well, I don't feel like I can engage because I don't think I can manage all of that. You can't manage all of that. That's the beauty of the way the body works. So letting go of some of that ownership and that responsibility gives us a much healthier way of going, how do I engage? And if I get uncomfortable, can I become aware of that and maybe pace myself in a way that's more appropriate relative to my own lived experience?
Wow, thank you. So I want to start wrapping up now. We've unbelievably been talking for an hour. I think from someone who's not a scientist, there's a couple of things I want to say, but I want to, Tim and Joy, if you kind of just start to think about, Jerome there really managed to give us some real kind of, I think some really grounded ideas about how to think about our own power, how to take a breath, what that does to our brain. And if you guys try and think about just the things that you'd like to end with, and while you're doing that, I'll sort of just give my viewpoint, which is that someone who's not a scientist, I'm really stunned from this conversation how linked we are between the idea of difference, whether that be just around belief systems, whether that be around racism, and how our brain works, but also how closely our brain works for those same reasons in a pandemic in terms of ourselves and more individualism. And this idea that really taking a breath, stop, that you can be uncomfortable, that these are parts of your brain that have been around for ages, where they just literally, they don't tell you whether you are in a war of words or whether you're fighting for your life. For me, I always say it, I can't get away without saying it. Someone from Croydon that doesn't kind of think these ways, it's just about going, stop, Suzanne. Are you really fighting for your life? Or are you in an uncomfortable space? Can that uncomfortable space serve you? And how long will you be there for? And what is the best decision that you can make at this moment? And asking myself those questions, whether I am probably being visceral and foul against someone who has different political belief, or whether I'm sitting in my room during a pandemic on my own. Or seems to me it's interesting how complicated, but also how simple they are. Joy or Tim, either to one of you to wrap up, whoever wants to jump in first.
I don't mind jumping in. Yes, yes to all of that. I think you're right on point. I think some of that is very intuitive. Ultimately, I think just like Jerome said, we have the ability to choose. Like we might not be able to decide what's going to happen, what's coming next week, what's around the corner. But as one of my business professors said, you always have the right to choose how you want to respond. And that there's a lot of power in that. You know, if somebody makes you mad, you can always decide, okay, am I going to walk away? Am I going to fight? What am I going to do? So that is one of the ways that we start to take control of our brain. So we're not just functioning on autopilot. I think some of the other things that will be helpful going forward for us, you know, taking a moment, stopping and breathing and pausing, slowing things down when things seem to be so hectic and functioning on like hyperspeed around us. One of the things I mentioned before was speaking positivity over our lives, over our dreams, over our children, over our spouses, over our country, over our communities. Taking time to challenge limiting thoughts, because they pop in our heads all the time. And it does take a lot of energy, but saying, no, that's not true. I can do this, or I will go there. I will accomplish this. Taking time to visualize a better reality for yourself. And then lastly, reaching out for help. You know, in a time where we are so distanced, there are still ways we can reach out. And whether that's to a therapist or to family, a mentor, a confidant, just finding ways to still stay connected is going to be part of how we get through this time.
Brilliant. And Tim, I'm going to come to you, sort of the place that I started, the place of neuroscience. I guess having sat through this conversation for an hour plus, what are your observations? What are the things that you'd like to leave us with around power, pandemic, people, and our brain?
Yeah, I think it's complicated, isn't it? I think it's been a fascinating conversation just to think about, you know, how we respond to situations. And I think what's come across to me is that, you know, how we respond differently. You know, I run clinics here for people with dementia, and two people can have the same kind of, you know, same Alzheimer's disease, perform the same on the cognitive tests, but how they respond to it and how their families respond to it can be very, very different. And their perception of power in that situation can depend on lots of different things, and their background, you know, their social situation, how they naturally respond to things. And I've spent a long time trying to work out what it is that helps people respond differently. I think today's conversation has helped me think through that a bit more. You know, how we can respond to things in a positive in a negative situation, and have some control and some sense of power, even when terrible things are going on around us, and how we can link that to, you know, just maybe from the neurobiology point of view, just to leave that idea that, you know, we can train the brain and train our gut feelings to respond in a different way. And it's a slow process. It's difficult. It's not easy. But we all have that capacity to do that.
Wow. Okay. So I'm going to wrap us up. We're running a little over, but I just wanted to explore those last ideas. I cannot thank you enough. I think we are going to try and edit this and put it up on the website. I would like to invite you all to share your social media handles there so that people can find you all. I'd invite you all to connect, and I'd invite everyone listening, actually, out of all of this, if I synthesize it and simplify it, it's this: we're living in a pandemic, we're living together, we're all human beings. We don't quite know where power resides. We're looking at that. But what we do know is that we can stop, take a breath, and most of the time, that bear is not chasing us. Thank you.